So for the grammar, I use a textbook called Korean Made Simple 2. And since the author, Billy, is a foreigner, he actually manages to explain things more intuitively than a native speaker might. I also like how all the chapters include a lot of vocabulary and some practice problems, as well as some jokes here and there. So I use OneNote to take all my notes digitally, since my computer is a 2-in-1 device, and it just makes it a lot easier to both handwrite things as well as organize all my notes, etc., etc. I also love the split screen feature, which is really useful for both taking notes as well as making review sheets. For vocab, you really can't go wrong with either Quizlet or Anki. So Quizlet is very intuitive to use. It presents the information in a lot of different ways, and I also like how it makes the audio super accessible.
줄.
On the other hand, Anki definitely has a steeper learning curve, but I think that ultimately you can do more with it. So I myself am still new to Anki and I can't speak to everything it has to offer, but I really like how well it integrates with this technique called spaced repetition, which essentially optimizes when you should be reviewing each term for the best retention. I'll link some videos down below that explain it slightly better. So now the fun part, practicing. So to practice both my speaking and my writing, I like to use HelloTalk, which is this messaging app that lets you connect with native speakers. And since it is specifically geared towards language learning, they offer a lot of in-chat features like corrections and translations and audio messages. And they also have basic classes for the language of your choice. So for reading practice, I really like to use webtoons, which are these webcomics that originated from Korea. And they now have original content in other languages as well, from English to Spanish to Chinese, but the best or most popular webtoons are still usually the Korean ones. I find webtoons actually lend themselves really well to language learning because there's a visual accompaniment to the text. They usually use simpler language, well, some of them at least, and you always have the English translations to draw from. They're also really engaging story-wise, and it takes a lot less time to read a chapter of a webtoon than a chapter of a textbook. So I've been really into Meow Man lately, just because the language is simple enough for me to understand most of it, but also it's really funny. And so I'll typically read the chapter in Korean first, and then compare it with the English version to see if there's anything I missed, if there's any vocabulary that I didn't know, or if the humor didn't translate as well, etc., etc. Finally, we have my favorite form of practice, K-dramas and movies! So watching these has probably helped me the most out of these three methods. It really helps you get a sense of the intonation and rhythm of the language.
제시카 외동딸 일리노이 시카고 거선배는 김치모 그는 이사촌
as well as common expressions,
파이팅!
and slang.
Punch.
You also learn more about cultural idiosyncrasies like the drinking culture in Korea, which is very different from in America, as well as ceremonies like funerals. You might also learn some basic things about Korean history, and for that I would really recommend the drama Mr. Sunshine. As fun as it is to watch K-dramas, however, it is still a form of studying, and so your mind should still be very active in identifying vocabulary, in analyzing when you use which grammar form in which situation, etc., etc. It is also important to remember that K-dramas provide an exaggerated version of reality, and so take everything you see with a grain of salt.
Punch.
For extra resources, you really can't go wrong with YouTube. And the person who made my textbook actually has a YouTube channel, and it sort of supplements or makes up for the teacher aspect that is so lacking when you only study from a textbook. And he's able to cover a wide range of topics that he wouldn't have been able to in the textbook, like speaking on the different dialects and what they sound like in Korean, on pronunciation, etc., etc. Talk to Me in Korean is another highly recommended YouTube channel / textbook company. I think their textbook series is actually a lot more comprehensive than Billy's Korean Made Simple series, and they have different books for different kinds of learning, as well as podcasts, etc., etc. They also have a secondary channel called Talk to Me in 100% Korean, which is unique in that it uses Korean to teach Korean. And this is of course for more advanced students, but it's really useful as another form of language immersion. I would also like to bring up the channel Yongguk Namja, or Korean Englishman, which isn't a Korean learning channel specifically, although they do have some videos where they try to get Ollie, one of the hosts, to improve his Korean to varying degrees of success. But I just think that they showcase Korean culture in such a unique way, partially because they are foreigners, but also just because they are creative and because the hosts are absolutely hilarious together. Additionally, if you're looking for a Korean learning community, I found the Korean subreddit to be incredibly welcoming and helpful. There are users of all levels, and there's always someone who's willing to share their resources, or to answer a quick question, or even to become your study buddy. Lastly, if you have an Android phone, I would highly recommend the app, Read Korean. It is integrated with a bunch of Korean online dictionaries like Naver, which is essentially Korean Google. It has a vocabulary feature and the ability to test yourself. It has conjugation charts, which comes in handy so much. It has pronunciation. It can help you with numbers and gives you information on when to use them. And it also has a list of idioms. Not to mention, it offers all of this and is ad-free. So how you study is just as important as what you use to study, and I would highly recommend creating some sort of schedule to ensure that you're studying consistently, whether it is 1 time a week or 3 times a week. With my newfound time in quarantine, I tried studying every single day, whether it was reading through a chapter in my textbook or learning new vocabulary, and I also set aside specific days for review. I actually couldn't keep up with this schedule, and I ended up burning out towards the end. So when you make your schedule, make sure that it's one that you can follow both consistently but also sustainably. But most importantly, know your motivation. With quarantine and all this extra time that we have, there's been a societal pressure towards productivity. And for a while, I actually agreed with that mindset, and I still do to some extent, but it took me a while to realize that my definition of productivity is very different than most people's definition. In general, we tend to associate productivity with output, tangible output, like grades or money, and it's why we don't consider a hobby to be valuable unless we can monetize it. But for me, productivity is more an emotional state. It means doing what is fulfilling to you. And so regardless of why you want to learn Korean, whether you simply like the way that it sounds, or you got into it through K-pop, it should be something that fulfills you. Which isn't to say that learning a language is always enjoyable. In fact, most of the time it is incredibly frustrating, and I constantly feel as though I've plateaued in my learning. But at the end of the day, I know that I'm at least making some progress, because I can now understand it when someone says,
난쟁아, 잘 들어봐. Let me show you what a queen do. I keep us classy, but I slap a
Give your heart and soul to me, and life will always be